It's an honor to be here at the State Museum, and particularly in its last few months here. You know, it's going to seem so different in the new wonderful quarters down at Bicentennial Mall. And ironically, we're talking about the Centennial today. So those of you in the room probably remember how we celebrated our bicentennial. We built Bicentennial Mall. And one of the great things about Bicentennial Mall is, since they built that, you have this unobstructed view of the Capitol. As you know, we have lots of tall buildings and condos and hotels going up all around the city, but because Bicentennial Mall there, and our new great State Museum isn't that tall, and the new State Library and Archives will be down there too. So, but I'm here to tell you about the Centennial Exposition that we had in 1897. I wanted to thank the head of the State Museum, my friend Ashley, for being here, and thank you for your leadership in shepherding this wonderful project out of the basement to a beautiful new building. We had this habit of putting museums in basements here in a while. Before the State Museum was here, many of you might know it was in the basement of the War Memorial Auditorium, which is actually when they started the Country Music Hall of Fame and started putting those plaques out. Before they had a real building, the plaques were also in the basement of the War Memorial Auditorium. But the Tennessee Centennial Exposition is truly one of my favorite events in Tennessee history. And when you think about all the great things that were going on, we had a reason to celebrate and a reason to kind of party in 1897. So, but those historians in the room will know, well, wait a minute, 1897, George Washington signed the papers making Tennessee the 16th state of the Union on May 1st, 1796. So if we were going to, June 1st, 1796. So if we're going to celebrate 100 years, it should have been 1896. Well, there was a bad economy in the 19th century, and Chicago, which is kind of the benchmark of expositions, their World's Fair celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus coming to the Americas was not in 1892, it was in 1893 for that same bad economy. But why did we even do this? There was a lawyer who wrote a letter to the editor. Remember newspapers and letters to the editors? And he wrote a letter to the editor saying, you know, Tennessee's about to have its 100th anniversary. We should celebrate and have a big party like a World's Fair like they did in Chicago and like they did in Atlanta. And this idea got traction, and you know, the civic leaders thought, hey, good idea, let's do this. But these are very expensive to do. In fact, our exposition in the kind of early expositions from 1876 from Philadelphia to 1815, the two California expositions in San Francisco and San Diego, ours was the only one to make money. Now, albeit only $2,000, but everyone else lost money because these were very expensive to do and they didn't have a big return. So what did we have to be proud of in 1896? We were the westernmost state of America for a while, and everyone knows one of our famous nicknames were the Athens of the South. Originally, we were called the Athens of the West because we were the foremost western state. So we had that going for us, but we also had, in 1896, we had sent 3 people to Washington to be president of the United States. Who could say that outside of Virginia and Massachusetts? Maybe Ohio later. And so we thought, okay, we're gonna have this big party and we're gonna celebrate all the great things that make Tennessee great. So they put together an executive committee, as normally you would do when you put something together like this. And it was 16 men. And the 16 men decided we would raise the money and that we would kind of pick a site. Now, Centennial Park ended up being the site that they picked, but does anyone know what the runner-up site was that could have been the site for the exposition? It's been in the news a lot lately. It's a place called Cumberland Park. Today you know this as a fairgrounds. And what they liked about Cumberland Park was it was high up on a hill, and they were gonna put this Parthenon up there, kind of like the Acropolis, and be high up, and that was great. But kind of like today, you needed transportation to get there. You also needed lodging and accommodations, and that area just didn't have anything. So they picked the old West Side Park, which was on West End. And that was actually a good site. You know, before the Civil War, it's where our state fair was. After the Civil War, it was a racetrack. And it was centrally located where people could come in. And I'll tell you a funny little story related to the area. They actually, so we now know metro government. We take the county and the city and merge it together. So before that, we did our due diligence. We talked to the folks in Atlanta and Philadelphia and Chicago and New Orleans that had these expositions before, and we learned all the best practices from them. Well, one of the best practices was in Atlanta, they had the gates of the exposition and everything was great. And then outside the gates, there was all sorts of weird things going on. There was gambling, there was drinking, there was prostitution, and we didn't want that to happen. But in 1897, the area that we now know as Centennial Park was not in the city of Nashville, and it was in the county. The city had a lot of laws. The county didn't really have many laws. So they were worried if they'd had this there, all this kind of activity would go on. So the founders of the exposition decided they were going to create a brand new city called Centennial City, and the outline of the city would basically be Centennial Park. And I see my friend Nancy Russell over there, who knows a lot about state government and used to work for the great Senator Douglas Henry. They had a bill go through the state legislature to basically make this a city, and then it would sunset and go away 6 months afterwards. And they had a mayor, and they had a city council, and the only reason for doing this was to pass laws banning not all alcohol. They had beer, because Gerst was served. They had wine. They didn't like whiskey. And they also banned gambling, prostitution, and other things. So it's all fun until somebody sues, right? And of course, somebody sued and said, you know, this is a farce. This city thinks a farce. And it went to the Tennessee Supreme Court, and they upheld it. They said, you might not like it, but they did it right. So we were ready to welcome the people in. And one of the things that I always like to say when I talk about the exposition is, when you think about the days before before automobiles and planes, Nashville wasn't the easiest city to get to, although we were centrally located. And so in 6 months before cars and planes, we had 1.8 million people come to Centennial Park for this exposition. Think about that, 1.8 million people. That's just huge. And the biggest day that we had honoring John W. Thomas, who Nancy knows is the great-grandfather of the Bird family here in town, and who Thomas Bird is named after, and it's Andrew Bird, Barney, Ben, that family. He was the driving force behind the exposition, and the day that celebrated him and his leadership during this exposition, 97,000 people showed up in Centennial Park in one day. And what was interesting about that is the population of Nashville was only 79,000. And if you were in Nashville during this exposition, no matter how much money you had or little you had, you went to this. This was a big deal event that you would never see before. Today we could get on planes and go to Disney World, or today we could get on planes and go to the Smithsonian, but we didn't really have a lot there. So this was it. So let's talk about kind of how we got there and what this was to begin with. So everybody wanted to promote the exposition. This is something out of my collection that's on my Instagram page. And so this was the back of an envelope. And someone had basically, the business names on the front, but on the back, you have the 3 Tennessee presidents I mentioned, and the picture of the Parthenon. Why do you think the Parthenon was the kind of center stone of the exposition in 1897? And people wondered, like, wow, we were really smart. We picked a good building and we built, it's still the only full-size replica in the world. But the reason the Parthenon was picked, it was kind of already in the air, because in 1896, the year before, the first modern Olympics were held in Athens, Greece. So we had the Parthenon around, and so we honored that. This is the Parthenon under construction. And interestingly enough, remember I told you about the June 1st, 1896, when George Washington signed the document making Tennessee the 16th state, last state to join the Union under President Washington, that we decided we still want to celebrate our centennial on the actual day. So on June 1st, a bunch of people got to the park, and the Parthenon wasn't finished. Most of these buildings hadn't even come out of the ground. And the way that the men worked there were all these little subcommittees. There was a children's building, there was a Negro building, there was a women's building. And the women, who were very scrappy at the time, they wanted, and remember, the executive committee was all men. Not African Americans, not women on there. They were all men. And so on the actual anniversary, a year before the actual centennial would kick off, the women, and that's the leader of the women's building, Mrs. Van Leer Kirkman, or Kate Kirkman as she's known, they presented the keys to this building. So on June 1st, while buildings were still coming out of the ground, Parthenon not finished, the women's like, here's our building, we're done, we're finished, where are you guys? This building was designed to look like the Hermitage. And what's interesting about the exposition, and I'm on the board of the Parthenon here, which is where some of my things are on display from the exposition that I've collected. There's a big display that's going to be there another 3 or 4 weeks in the rear part, but then there's some other things that are on the permanent display. But what was interesting about this building was, to me, this was the birthplace of the women's suffrage movement in Nashville. Because I remember reading a book of the history of this exposition written by the man who basically was head of PR and part of the 16. And it's a big, thick book, and I was reading it one day, and I kind of looked at, there was one sentence, almost kind of like a throwaway sentence, and Susan B. Anthony came here. What? And I'm on the board of the Parthenon, and I was thinking, we don't have that up on our wall. It's not part of our story. She was here? Yes, Susan B. Anthony. And so I did more research, and yes, she was here. And while she was here, she spoke at the Ryman. She spoke at the Vine Street Temple, which is now the Jewish Temple on Harding. And she also spoke at Fisk University. So I would encourage people, you know, when history gets written sometimes, it's written from one perspective, so sometimes you have to update it. And as we're building this great new museum, you will see a different way of interpreting and displaying history than we have in the past. So Susan B. Anthony came to this building and spoke to the women of Nashville. Needless to say, she did not get a very good reception, because before Susan B. Anthony got involved in the women's suffrage movement, she was involved in the temperance movement, but she was more importantly involved in the movement to free slaves. And that didn't go over very well. As a matter of fact, when she spoke at Fisk University, she didn't speak to them about women's rights and women's suffrage. She spoke to them about the whole emancipation movement. That's what the Fisk students wanted to have her speak about. So Susan B. Anthony came here. And it was this point where a young Nashville native named Ann Dallas Dudley first met Susan B. Anthony. Ann Dallas Dudley became the leader of our women's suffrage movement and was instrumental in helping pass the 19th Amendment in 1920. And it was also Ann Dallas Dudley who marched these streets near here, near the state capitol, to Centennial Park in 1914, the very first women's suffrage parade in the South. And she spoke to a crowd of 1,000 people in front of the Parthenon. And the Tennessean said at the time it was the first time a woman in Tennessee history had spoken outside to a large crowd. So when you talk about history, you could really tell the story of Nashville history through this great exposition. So the women had their building. This is the Negro building. And this is a very nice building, by the way. It was a 2-story building with a cafe on the top. And the reason the cafe was there, we were still in segregation times, Jim Crow. So if you were African American, like my great-grandparents who went, they would have to eat there. There's no other place that during the exposition they could eat. And inside the the Negro building were things highlighting the African American experience: education, inventions, literary writings. And J.C. Napier was the old head of the Negro department, but he got into kind of a disagreement with the 16 men about what this building would highlight. He wanted it to highlight what it did, which was kind of the progress of the African Americans, the former slaves, and some of them wanted a more kind of backwards looking antebellum part. And a matter of fact, on the grounds of Centennial Park during the exposition, there was a faux cotton field where they had people, black African Americans, picking cotton and singing. You know, this is like a kind of virtual zoo almost. But Napier resigned from the board and they picked a teacher to take his place. And at the time they said, oh, Napier had health issues in 1897, he couldn't do it. My grandfather, who was a minister in this town, gave J.C. Napier's eulogy in 1941. So no health issues there. But what was interesting about that, and I talked about Susan B. Anthony. So Susan B. Anthony comes, the leader of the women's movement in all of America, the leader of the African American movement, because Frederick Douglass had died 2 years before in 1895, was Booker T. Washington, founder of Tuskegee. He came to our exposition. And those in the audience who know the Atlanta Exposition, one of Booker T. Washington's famous speeches called the Atlanta Compromise speech was given during their World's Fair when he talks about cast down your buckets wherever you are. And so we had Booker T. Washington, we had Susan B. Anthony. Who's missing? The President of the United States, William McKinley. This is a palm card that I had, which was printed by the Treasury, the same people that print our money. And it's basically advertising, you know, our president and vice president and our exposition. So we had the prestige of Washington. And back in the old days, so the president of the United States just recently came here. You know, you spend a few hours here, wheels up on Air Force One, you're back to Washington. But McKinley came here in June of 1897 and spent 2 days here. He stayed at the Maxwell House Hotel, and there was a very long carriage procession of about 25 carriages taking him from the Maxwell House to Centennial Park. And just like today, when the president comes, who comes with the president? The media. And so papers, newspapers, the New York Times, Boston Globe, Washington Post, all the Chicago Tribune, all the city's major newspapers came here. And when they were here, they wrote about Tennessee. They wrote about the exposition. So we had all this great, we were on the front page of like every newspaper in the country because President McKinley came here. So that was a really, and the other people that came, his entire cabinet. Now today our cabinet's like 23 or 24 people. Back then it was about 8. You didn't have an agricultural secretary or HUD or all these other, you had the Secretary of War, Secretary of State, you had Treasury Secretary, and all the cabinet came with McKinley too. And there was a lunch for McKinley later on where he had lunch on the grounds, and that was a very hot ticket, needless to say. And here's my interesting thing I'll tell you about President McKinley. Does anyone know how he died? He was assassinated, he was shot. And where was he shot? Buffalo, New York. Why was he in Buffalo, New York? They had an exposition in 1901. And so when he was here in Nashville, they put an article in the newspaper and said, you want to meet the President of the United States? He's going to be standing outside this building for a couple hours and he will greet people. So thousands and thousands of people got to shake the president's hand. Isn't that great? Not a cross word was said to him. So McKinley goes back to Washington and says, those people were so nice in Tennessee, and I really like that exposition. And so when he gets invited to Buffalo in 1901, you know, they do that again. Let's put in the paper in advance that the president's going to be just standing right there and, you know, greeting people. And so when he did that, someone shot him. And he died a few days later in Buffalo. So he was lulled to a false sense of security by our great Southern hospitality here. So we might have been slightly responsible for losing the president here because of our kindness. This is a ribbon that comes from the exhibition. It's actually on display here too at the State Museum. There was a wonderful exhibit just in the middle of this section here of artifacts from the State Museum from the Tennessee Centennial. We had ribbons. People proudly wore ribbons around. There were all sorts of days, alumni days, bankers days, plumbers days, all sorts of people came about for this exposition, and you'd have your own theme day, and that was just very important. So fun and games. Who remembers Opryland? You know, one of the favorite parts of Opryland was the Flume Zoom, which was the water ride. This is the 19th century version of the Flume Zoom, which was called Shoot the Chutes. And it was a very kind of rudimentary ride, that you had to climb these stairs up the back, and these little kind of vehicles would just kind of go down this little wooden kind of plank and then splash in the water. And so there was a kind of famous story where, and as you could see it hit, you know, sometimes these things turned over. And so it turned over once, and this woman was thrown out of the car, and she was flailing, and she was very concerned that she would drown. And the person kind of standing next to it basically said, well, just stand up. It's only like 3 feet of water. You could see the sign that says, this lake is only 30 inches deep. And when they drained it after the exposition, they found people's canes and dentures and jewelry, and it was just a treasure trove of things here. So during the day, the exposition had all these great exhibits in the building. There's an agricultural building, there's a commerce building. You know, so the railroad people put this thing on. So John W. Thomas was the president of the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railroad. They were the only people that had money in the 1890s. So think of them as Google or Apple today. And while the rest of the country was kind of suffering, the economy, they had a lot of money. And so the railroad actually bought a lot of the goods here and put train tracks all over Centennial Park to make it easy to build these temporary buildings. And on the Commerce Building, there was a statue that they put on top of the Commerce Building of Mercury. Older Nashvillians will remember after the World's Fair, they decided to put Mercury on their brand new Union Station that they had built in 1900. The same Mercury which sadly came crashing down in 1962 in a heap of rubble, and they recycled it. And now the current owners of the Union Station Hotel kind of have a two-dimensional flat Mercury kind of on the top of the tower. But the original Mercury was there. Also the original Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt statue, those of you who went to Vanderbilt kind of know it's outside of Kirkland, that was originally outside the Parthenon. They moved it. So there was all sorts of fun and games during the evening. They had these rides. They had water rides. They had kind of Thomas Edison's kind of early movies were shown here. They had, Thomas Edison sent an early version of an X-ray machine, which was on display here. And so there were all these things that Nashvillians had never seen before. There was a giant seesaw. Oh, this is a bit of trivia. So this is the Knights of the Pythias building. And some of you might have seen this building in Franklin. All these buildings were temporary, including the Parthenon. So there's the Parthenon in the back. The Memphis building was the pyramid. And so the Knights of the Pythias building was moved out to Highway 96 in Franklin, where it still is today. So that's really one of the last big remaining parts of the exposition. This is a medal. So before we had Oscars and Grammys and all these other big awards, you had medals from World's Fairs. There's a piano around the corner that the company Star Piano won a gold medal. These medals were as prestigious as anything you could get because we didn't have Nobel Peace Prizes or anything. So if you got a medal during the exposition, that was a big deal. So this medal, which was a silver medal, was given to a company that won in their category. There were all sorts of categories. My favorite medal story is, so remember I talked about Centennial City. We allowed beer. Gerst won the gold medal for beer in our exposition. There was wine allowed, but we didn't like whiskeys for some reason. We didn't, you know, we'll have beer, we'll have wine, but no whiskey. And so there's this company, this little distillery down the road that couldn't enter our contest and couldn't get a medal here. But in 1904, St. Louis had a World's Fair, and that same little company entered, and they won the gold medal. And so today and ever since, the gold medal from the St. Louis Exposition is on the bottle of Jack Daniels. Look for it, it's there. It's been on there ever since. It could have been us, but this was a very big prize. This was taken from a tall, giant seesaw. So if those who know about the Chicago Exposition, one of the famous things that they debuted in Chicago was the Ferris wheel. It literally debuted at the Chicago Exposition. And we didn't want to be like Chicago. It's like, oh, Ferris wheel. We had this. Wait a minute. Oh, the giant seesaw is what we had. It was basically a 200-foot seesaw. And the seesaw went up and down and up. And we thought, you know, once people ride the giant seesaw, they won't even be talking about the Ferris wheel anymore. And of course, we know what happened to the giant seesaw. Although I'm sure it was beautiful that, you know, you're 200 feet above before skyscrapers. I mean, can't you just see the sunshine? I mean, it was just really interesting to see the city like that. And so this was taken. Here's a little bit of trivia, nerdy trivia for exposition people or Parthenon people. This is the original Parthenon. The later Parthenon that we have today was rebuilt in the 20s. It took them about 10 years. There are two things in this original Parthenon that you don't see in the current Parthenon. One are the stairs on the side, and the other is the skylight. So you could tell the age of the Parthenon. If you see the skylight, that's the original one. And the other interesting thing about the Parthenon, it was the arts building. So, and it was also Nashville's first arts museum, that they had art in the building, kind of floor to ceiling stacked. And so the flagpole, which was also a very tall structure, that's where the statue is today in Centennial Park. And everyone was like, who is that guy? Who's the statue? That's John W. Thomas. That's the president of the railroad. That's the guy that we wouldn't have had the exposition without. And then the Memphis building, the auditorium where McKinley spoke. And so the exposition, so what did the exposition really mean for Nashville? I was talking to Nancy before, and she talked about some relatives who came here for the exposition just to visit and ended up kind of staying and moving. And so you know people all the time that, you know, they come to Nashville for some convention or they come here for something, they just fall in love with it and they move. And another friend of mine said that during the same very tough economic times, there was a lot of people that were struggling and their relatives had a dairy that almost closed. And after the, because of the exposition, they got the dairy contract and it really kept them afloat. And that dairy later ended up selling to Purity Dairy and just being very successful. So what the exposition did, besides bringing 1.8 million people to Nashville, is it put us on the map. It allowed us to be seen differently by the United States. People came here, and it's not a coincidence that the first part of the turn of the century, we started banks, we started insurance companies, and Nashville was a southern city that was starting to compete with cities like Birmingham and Memphis and Atlanta, and it was all because of this exposition. Thank you. And now I understand it's question and answer time, so I will field questions about this or anything if you want a random Nashville history question. So, questions? Nancy. Bring the microphone for Nancy. Okay. Nancy asked, I think, what happened to the buildings and why did they tear them down? So the buildings were only meant to be temporary. They were made out of cardboard and plaster, wood, temporary, because all these expositions, whether it be Atlanta, Chicago, they were all temporary buildings. And because you just didn't have a lot of money, and it's like, they just thought, well, this is just for this one event. And so all these cities, so San Diego, same thing, temporary buildings during their exposition, but they had something, they had all these wild animals during their exposition in San Diego, and they said, you know, we kind of like these wild animals, let's keep them after the exposition. So that's where the San Diego Zoo came from, their exposition. But the Parthenon, like I said, was rebuilt, but all these other buildings, they look really grand and all that, but they were just made cheaply and not made for the longevity. Other questions? Yes?
What's the story with Athena?
The story with Athena. So the original Parthenon, meaning the Greek Parthenon, had a statue of Athena inside. We don't know what exactly it looked like, but we do know she was there. On the outside of this, I don't think you could see it in this picture, there was a palace Athena, which was taller than the building of the Parthenon. It was just a big temporary statue. The interesting thing about Athena that Alan LaQuire has redone in the Parthenon today, you know, growing up here, you'd go to the Centennial Park and the Parthenon, there'd be this little kind of donation box, and they'd say, help us build Athena. And you thought, they're never going to do that. You know, I saw that box forever, and then they finally did it. My favorite kind of Athena story about the Parthenon is, you know, Athena has this big shield and this big spear that she's holding. Alan, who made most of Athena in his studio and then kind of moved it, was looking for something to do the spear, and he just thought, you know, he was going around the park, and he knows the McDonald's next door, and they had a flagpole, and so he bought that flagpole, and that's the spear of Athena. It's the old McDonald's flagpole. Yes? Questions?
David, could you tell the story about the building that was moved to Highway 96?
Mm-hmm.
Because if I remember, that's got a pretty interesting history too, doesn't it?
That's the Knights of the Pythias building that we were talking about, that building in the center with the dome. You know, after the exposition, and it's interesting, everything was kind of for sale. You know, there's a wonderful chair in the State Museum that comes from Macy's, sent down a chair and pieces of furniture. And the only reason that we know it was related to the exhibition because it had a sticker under it. And a matter of fact, some of the things came here from other countries, and they came here tariff-free. And if they sold them after the exposition, you had to pay the tariffs and excise tax. So I've seen things, and I have things that have the sticker on it that you paid the tax. But this building, so the Knights of the Pythias, which is like a Masonic organization, this building literally, it's got this dome, it's very grand, the columns. You know, someone bought it afterwards and they moved it out to Franklin, you know, and they're talking about in the 19th century, so no easy task. But literally, that is probably the biggest piece of Centennial Exposition memorabilia, if you will, that exists, that they moved the whole building. It was on the market. You could have bought this house for, I think, like $1.2 million a few years ago, but probably most of that was the land, that it was sitting on a very prominent piece of land in Highway 96. Other questions?
Can you tell us the Memphis building being the pyramid?
Mm-hmm.
I've always assumed it was a Memphis in Egypt.
A Memphis what?
A Memphis in Egypt. But
yes.
I don't know if that's the reason why. What's the story? What did they have in the pyramid?
So what they did, the cities, they begged these cities to have buildings to help pay for the exposition. New York sent a building, Chicago had a building, Memphis, Chattanooga, and the kind of ancient, Egyptian, yes, Memphis and the whole, the Nile and the Mississippi River, there's always been this kind of tie to Egypt. And so, long before we built that dinosaur of a pyramid in Memphis that is no longer, it's I guess a Bass Pro Shop now, yes, we did have this grand pyramid there. Any other questions? Well, I would encourage you to go to the Parthenon and see some of the things that I've collected over the years. And people ask me about collecting, and I go to flea markets, I go to estate sales, and a lot of the things that, there are not that many Centennial Exposition collectors. It's a very niche collect. It's not like keeping baseball cards or stamps, but they tell so many interesting stories. And since 1.8 million people came, I'm always seeing things that I've never seen before that look like one-of-a-kind things. There were lots of things being made that people took back with them, spoons and glasses, but then also the paper and the programming. I've never seen a picture of Susan B. Anthony there, sadly. I've never seen a picture of Booker T. Washington at the exposition, or very few things from the Negro building. I have a calendar with a picture of the Negro building, have some stationery, but it's just very rare. But I will say this about our Centennial. We had a lot to be proud of. We celebrated it well. We had about 36 governors come to Nashville, including William Jennings Bryant came with people from Nebraska because Nebraska was hosting the next World's Fair in 1898 in Omaha. And so literally everybody came down here for this. Teddy Roosevelt, the governor of New York, unfortunately did not come down, but when we were organized this, the group from Nashville went up and met with him about New York's involvement. And New York actually gave us a building and sent a lot of people down there. So go to Centennial Park. This is one of our great stories of how literally we came together, all Tennesseans, to celebrate 100 years of statehood, and we still have this lasting legacy of the Parthenon Centennial Park. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Everyone, thanks so much for attending. Please come back and visit us again. See you next month at the next Lunch and Learn.
Thank you. Thanks for being here.